There's always a basis for influence, and that basis is usually present. These characters aren't 100% copies of their base tales. The characters' personalities are all original, but there are definite, unavoidable similarities to the tales in question. With that said, let's begin. Ruby Rose draws parallels to Little Red Riding Hood. Aside from the two sharing a red hood, Little Red was always seen as younger than the other fairy tale girls. She was a child, at least in most representations. Ruby is also younger than the others. Small detail, very easily coincidental. Red Riding Hood was a small kid, naive, but brave. She walked through the woods to her grandmother's house, alone, and with a desire to help out. Ruby is like that too. Though she may not be delivering food, she's young and naive, but also brave. She really wants to help her world, just like Hood was motivated by a desire to help her grandmother. Weiss is primarily based off the tale Snow White. Looking at Weiss and how she acts, we can start to see the resemblances between her and her tale. On the surface, her name literally is German for white snow. In her trailer, the lyrics specifically say, "Mirror, mirror, tell me something," just like in the tale. As we go deeper, we can start to see the psychological similarities as well. The evil queen has a desire to be the most beautiful woman in the world, the fairest of them all, as she likes to say. Weiss has a similar goal, quote, "I'm not perfect, not yet, but I'm still leagues better than you," end quote. Snow White, in her tale, is hunted down by a huntsman who is supposed to kill Snow and bring proof to the queen. Weiss is actively being hunted down by a similar force, the White Fang. Blake is loosely based off Belle from Beauty and the Beast. A big part of Belle's story was the rose. For those of you who don't know, here's the quick version. The Beast was once a human, but because of his greed, a spell was put on him and thus he was transformed into a beast. He was given a flower that would bloom until his 21st year. He had until that time to fall in love and earn the love of someone else. Blake also had a flower attached to her, both by name and by character. Belladonna is a flower commonly known as Deadly Nightshade. She is also connected to Adam. When you look at his back, he has an emblem. And what is it, other than a rose? Now you might be thinking that since Blake is essentially beauty, Adam must be the beast. And while that is absolutely possible, and Adam was the real name of the prince in the fairy tale, the role seems to fit Blake more. Blake appears to fill the role of both beauty and the beast. Belle never really got along with her villagers, while in turn Blake never really got along with anyone. And her Faunus heritage didn't help her case constantly being discriminated by the people of her world. With Yang, she very much shares the personality of Goldilocks. Goldilocks was carefree. She would go into others' houses eating their stuff and sleeping in their beds. Goldilocks was fun-loving without much thought towards the consequences of what could happen. Yang is also carefree and fun-loving. She's not worried about the consequences because in her mind, she can handle them. Until she can't. Following the story of Goldilocks, He Jr. Zhang is also an inspiration from the tale. His first name He is Chinese for black, while his last name Zhang means bear, combining to make Black Bear. His nickname Junior pulls all of this together to the point of his character's illusion, Baby Bear. Now before we get into Team Juniper, let me preface this by saying that each of their characters are inspired by someone who cross-dressed in their story. Not in RWBY. Come on, Jaune. I mean, have you no decency? You could have at least picked a pair of shoes that matched. Anyway, Jeanne Arc and Joan of Arc. Aside from the obvious name comparisons, the two share at least one similarity. They're both liars. And not in a bad way. The story goes, one day Joan of Arc heard voices which she perceived as God. She took his word and wished to bring victory to the French. However, she faced one problem. She was a woman. It was hard for women of the time to get into the army, so she dressed as a man so she could then get in. In the end, the king supported her desire to defeat the British and allowed her to lead the army. Jean had a similar problem in that he couldn't get into Beacon, the school for warriors. But since his gender wasn't the problem, he didn't have to disguise that. He had to hide the fact that he didn't have the skills to be there. He, like Joan, is becoming a leader. They both might have been nobodies when they were younger, but they became warriors, even if they had to lie to get into that position. Nora, Valkyrie, and Thor. The most obvious is they're both hammer-wielding warriors. Thor is one of the most important and famous gods in Norse mythology. He wielded his hammer Mjolnir and controls lightning, thunder, and storms. Nora is equally able to channel electrical energy and use that to her advantage. Going back to the statement of each member of Juniper being inspired by their cross-dressing counterpart, Thor did indeed dress as a woman. In the story, a giant had stolen Thor's hammer and demanded Freya as payment for it. The giant was seeking the goddess as his own wife. Instead of Freya, Thor dresses up as the bride himself, with Loki as his bridesmaid. The story continues from there, but I think you get the idea. Pyrrha, Nikos, and Achilles. According to the myths and stories composed long after the Iliad, Thetis, Achilles' mother, was extraordinarily concerned about her baby son's mortality. She did everything she could to make him immortal. She burnt him over a fire every night. She dressed his wounds with ambrosial ointment. But most importantly, she dunked him into the water of Styx, with a Y. The water was said to grant the invulnerability of the gods. However, his mother had gripped him so tightly by the foot as she dipped him into the river, that water never actually touched his heel, resulting in Achilles being invulnerable everywhere but his heel. But we'll get back to that. Because he has the invulnerability of a god, his reputation as a warrior quickly followed. Pyrrha's inspiration is uncanny. Pyrrha has been labeled the untouchable warrior, much like Achilles, who can't actually be touched theoretically. And even Pyrrha's name is from Achilles' story. When Achilles was 9 years old, a seer predicted that he would die heroically in battle against the Trojans. When his mother heard about this, she disguised him as a girl and sent him to live on the Aegean islands of Skyros. When disguised as a girl, he went by the name Pyrrha. Aside from their similarities as warriors, they're both, spoilers by the way, they both get shot in the heel prior to their death. Two phenomenal warriors, both struck in the heel before their death. Ren and Mulan. The parallels between the two are actually quite hard to see. Aside from Ren being a male version of Mulan, there aren't too many similarities. Sorry. Cardin Winchester and Henry Beaufort, otherwise known as the Cardinal of Winchester. Just like Jean d'Arc, this character's inspiration comes from the story of Joan of Arc. Henry presided over the trial of Joan of Arc prior to her being burnt at the stake. Velvet Scarlatina and the Velveteen Rabbit. She has several parallels to the tale of the Velveteen Rabbit. The name Velvet is an obvious pull from the title, as is her faunus type resembling a rabbit. Her last name is also a reference to the story. The boy who owns the Velveteen Rabbit contracts scarlet fever, also known as Scarlatina in the old days. One of the only parallels that could be drawn between the two is that Velvet is very quiet, not actively aggressive, similar to the rabbit who's incapable of moving, being just a toy. Team Sun, much like Team Juniper, have a theme to their designs, that being each of their members' looks are inspired by Big Bang, the popular K-pop group. So let's start off with Sun Wukong. Though it is uncertain which member his design is based off of, the character he's based off is Sun Wukong. Though the stories of each of them don't share much similarities, the characters absolutely do. Sun is from the classic novel Journey to the West. Both of them are monkeys who wield a bow staff. Aside from these, there isn't too much similarity story-wise. Scarlet David and Peter Pan. His inspiration may come from the popular character, but his design alludes to G-Dragon from Big Bang. Going back to his character, Scarlet can be seen wielding his cutlass and flintlock pistol, weapons that are usually associated with pirates. Even in one of his battles, Scarlet fought on a ship, or at least part of one. And who can be associated with such items? Peter Pan. Whoa, wait, hold on. Peter Pan isn't the one with the pirate ship, that's Captain Hook. But to that I say, not exactly. You see, Peter Pan had a sequel named Peter Pan in Scarlet, hence where his name comes from. Within that story, Peter Pan becomes so enveloped with his adventure that he indirectly became the new Captain Hook. He renamed the Jolly Roger the Jolly Peter, along with a few more parallels that made him become more of a pirate, hence allowing Scarlet David to draw inspiration from Peter Pan rather than Captain Hook. Sage Ayana and the Thracian sage Aesop. Aesop was an ancient Greek storyteller credited with a number of fables known as the Aesop Fables. However, during Rooster Teeth's RT Extra Life event, Miles and Carrie specified that Sage alludes to one of Aesop's characters, however, they don't recall which one. His design is inspired by Taeyang. Neptune and Neptune. Their biggest connection is water. Neptune has stated that he is afraid of the water, a similar connection to his voice actor Kerry Shawcross and his lack of ability to swim. Neptune, the Roman god, is god of the sea. Ironic to say the least. His design inspiration comes from Top. Penny Polendina and Pinocchio. Now while at first the connections don't seem to match up, they actually line up better than you think. Penny appears to be the only living robot that we've seen so far, much like Pinocchio, who's the only living puppet. And how exactly are puppets controlled? By strings. Penny's weapons are controlled and guided by thin strings, much like a puppet. But hey, that's just a coincidence, you're saying. Well, how about Pinocchio's most notable aspect? Lying. Most people know that when Pinocchio tells a lie, his nose grows longer. He is incapable of telling a lie without it being a complete tell. Penny, while her nose may not grow, she too has a tell. Hiccuping.
Everything's fine. I don't want to talk about it.
If that's not enough, take for example Geppetto. He wears a yellow wig resembling cornmeal pudding, also known as Polendina. This subsequently caused his neighbors to call him Polendina to annoy him. Ozpin, and Oscar Zoroaster Fadric Isaac Norman Henkel Emmanuel Ambroise Diggs, otherwise known as Ozpinhead, from The Wizard of Oz. Character-wise, only the colors seem to match between the two, along with a clever redirection of words. Instead of Professor Ozpin being called Ozpinhead, he is instead Ozpin, Headmaster of Beacon. Glinda Goodwitch, and Glinda the Good Witch of the South, also from The Wizard of Oz. Her no-nonsense attitude seems to reflect the original vision of Glinda the Good Witch. Peter Port likely alludes to Peter from the story Peter and the Wolf. In The Badge and the Burden, Port tells us a story about his childhood. Most of the story is blah blah blah, literally. But the parts that we can hear, especially at the end, consist of this.
In the end, the Beowulf was no match for my sheer tenacity, and I returned to my village with the beast in captivity and my head held high, celebrated as a hero.
The story of Peter and the Wolf is similar. In short, a young boy named Peter lives with his grandfather and one day sees a wolf. He gets a rope and ties a noose and manages to catch the wolf by the tail. Hunters come out from the woods and Peter stops them from killing it. They all gather up and bring the wolf to the zoo. In other words, both Peters caught a wolf and put it in captivity. Bartholomew Oobleck and Bartholomew from Dr. Seuss's Bartholomew and the Oobleck. This, like a few others, doesn't have too many parallels between the two. Character personality-wise, there isn't anything. The Oobleck in the story is a green substance lending to Dr. Oobleck's green character design. As we've seen through some of these characters' inspirations, some of them come from Norse mythology. James Ironwood can just as well be one of those. Ironwood is a common name applied to a number of different woods known for their hardness. Alternatively, Ironwood is also known as Arnvjord, a location within Norse mythology. Cinderfall and Cinderella. Cinderella may not be as mean and evil as Cinderfall, but they do share a few aspects. The shoes that Cinderfall wears with her red dress are indeed made of glass. This falls in with Cinderella, who was given a pair of glass slippers that only her feet would fit into. The two also share a similar story. Within the episode Dance Dance Infiltration, Mercury tells Cinder that she should return to the dance by midnight. In the end, she manages to make it back just before midnight. She transforms into her black dress and ditches her glass masquerade mask. This references how Cinderella needed to leave the ball by midnight, as that was when the spell that created her outfit and carriage would wear off. Roman Torchwick and Lampwick from Pinocchio. Lampwick laughs at all forms of authority, preferring to engage in more crooked activities like drinking and vandalizing. Though Torchwick may not be the drinking type, he surely doesn't have a respect for the law. Mercury Black and Mercury. Both of them share their most notable feature: legs. Mercury is the speedster of the gods, and even Mercury Black's emblem is a boot with wings, the god's famous footwear. Summer Rose and the poem The Last Rose of Summer. Now, at the time of this video, we know absolutely nothing about Summer Rose, but when you take a look at her grave, you can see the words, "Thus kindly I scatter," a line from the poem. The last summer of Rose is about the sadness and loneliness that is sometimes felt by a person towards the end of their lives when all of their contemporaries and friends have died. Weird considering that all of Team Stark is alive except for Summer. Theoretically.